Hi, welcome to this fresh teaching from Foundation Church Belfast. My name is David and I'm the pastor of Foundation Church, and today as we look at the Bible together, I want to try and encourage you, to challenge you, and to hopefully equip you as we face these uncertain and challenging times together. We're going to be looking together at this Old Testament character called Gideon. And we met him last week, and Gideon is one of the judges in the early phases of Israel's history. What is a judge? Well, a judge is someone who God raises up to deliver Israel from her enemies, kind of like a mini savior. And we saw the situation that Israel was in last week. From time to time, one of the other tribes that surrounded Israel, called the Midianites, they would swoop in probably around the time of harvest, and they would take and pillage all the produce that Israel had been working hard to raise up that year. They would take livestock, they would take the wheat, and this would happen time and again, year after year. And Israel were beaten down, they were oppressed, they were demoralized, and it says they cried out to God, and God sent and raised up another judge by the name of Gideon. But Gideon was not a mighty warrior at that stage. He's not a great leader. In fact, God finds him hiding away in the winepress. He was threshing wheat under the cover of the winepress so that he would not get found out by the Midianites. But God found him, God spoke to him, and God gave him a new identity. He said, "Greetings, O man of valor, man of strength, man of victory, greetings." He not only gave him that new identity, but he gave him a new mission. He says, "Now, go and save the people of Israel from the hand of the Midianites." And thirdly and finally, he gave him fresh confidence. He said, "The reason why you're a man of valor, the reason why you will have success in your military work is because I am with you. God is with you. I will strengthen your hand. I will bring you that victory." And so we might expect then, as we pick up the story from last week, we might expect that the next step is for Gideon to pick up the sword, to gather an army and go and take out the Midianites. But that's not what happens. In fact, as we read, it turns out that God has other things in mind. It seems to be that before they take on the external battle, there's an internal battle that Israel must fight, that Gideon has been called to take on. There's a deeper issue. There's an inner struggle that they must first overcome. What is that inner struggle? Well, it is idolatry. It is idolatry. It's the worship of idols. God says, remove your idols. And so here's the first teaching that we're going to see today. You cannot expect God's blessing whilst you're busy serving idols. You can't expect God's blessing whilst you're busy serving idols. Let me read to you from Judges chapter 6, where we get this story from. We'll pick it up from last week. "That night the Lord said to him," that is Gideon, probably through a dream or vision, "Take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah pole that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold there, with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down." You know that the name Gideon means hacker or chopper. And he was true to his name. He was called to hack down, chop down these idols. Kind of similar to one of the Chelsea legends. If you're into football, a man by the name of Ron Chopper Harris. He was famous. He was given the name Chopper because of his no-nonsense approach to tackling and defending. And similar for Gideon here, Gideon the hacker. He was called to hack down the idols that belonged to his father. The greater battle, the deeper battle that he was to face before he took on the Midianites. What was Baal and what was the Asherah pole? Well, Baal was a familiar, well-known god, of a pagan god of the surrounding tribes in the ancient Near East. And Asherah was a fertility goddess, often represented by a pole. And the two of them came together, kind of like a pagan husband and wife, Baal and Asherah. And both of these were possessed and purchased by Gideon's father, obviously a man himself, a man of worth, a man of influence. And Gideon's first calling was to take these things out, chop them apart, and show without a shadow of a doubt that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is God. Build an altar to him on top of the dead bodies of Baal and Asherah. That's what you're to do. And it says later on that Gideon was afraid. He was afraid of the repercussions because he realized that these gods, these idols, possessed power. They had an influence over people. They held sway over the people. And if he was to hack them down, then there would be repercussions. Maybe as you're listening to this and you're hearing the story of this calling to hack down, to chop down Asherah poles, you're thinking of primitive peoples and dancing around a totem pole. And we can think to ourselves as modern Western people, this is so far removed from our own culture. We don't have idols like that. We don't have Asherah poles in our back garden that we dance around and sacrifice to. But let's put pause on that for a second, because the Bible shows us that when it comes to idols, it's not just a case of wooden structures or metal structures that people sacrifice to. In fact, an idol, even in the ancient Near East, an idol is simply a representation of a god or goddess. So they never thought that the thing itself was the god or goddess, but simply a representation. If you wanted to worship the god, you do sacrifices for the idol. If you wanted to sacrifice or bow down to the god, you would bow down to the idol. It was like a representation, an image of the god. And the idea being that the god itself would provide you favor if you worship him or her, would provide you protection, would provide you peace or success or whatever blessing it is that you need if you worship it. And we think to ourselves in today's Western society, well, that's so very primitive, that's very narrow. We don't have that in today's technological society. We have knowledge. But let's just think for a second or two. Just because we don't have those structures on every street corner does not mean today that idols do not exist. In fact, if we take the Bible seriously, it shows us that an idol can be made out of anything. Anything in the heavens above or on the earth or in the water under the earth can be turned by us into an idol. What is an idol for us? Well, an idol is something that we can look to for security, look to for peace, look to for that protection and blessing, just like in the ancient Near East. So here's how you tell whether you have an idol or whether those around you have an idol in their lives. Here's what to look for. What is it that you personally look for security? Or think of it like this: what do you give your devotion to, your worship to? What will cause you to sacrifice your time and your money and your energy for? What would complete your life? Put it like this: what would complete your life if you had that thing, that person, that relationship? What would complete your life in your mind? Or on the flip side, what would make your life worthless if you lost it? You see, an idol for us, or for anybody for that matter, doesn't necessarily need to be a destructive or addictive thing, or even associated clearly with the dark forces of evil. Because for many of us, an idol can be something good, something ordinary, something right, but is elevated to the place of a god. Something good becomes a god. That's when it's an idol. And it can be a good thing, such as family or our children. You know, when they occupy a position within our thought life of power, of influence, that if they're happy, if they're successful, then I'm happy, I'm successful. I have peace, I have security. It might be for others of us, it's our career or making money that we prize and cherish above all things. Maybe it's an achievement or critical acclaim if we are in scholarship or research. Maybe it's approval in a romantic relationship. If I have that person, if I'm in love with them, if they love me, then I've got everything I need. There is my peace. There is my security. Maybe it's in a certain competency or certain skill that if we have that, if I can have that ability, then everything is fine. Maybe it's behind a great political cause or a social cause. Maybe we turn an idol out of our beauty or our power or our brains or our moral virtue. Take, for example, the sad story of Lance Armstrong. He at one time was considered to be the most successful cyclist in cycling history. He won multiple Tour de France's alongside other cycling tournaments. He was the best. But as his story went on and as the accolades continued, the bad news started tumbling out about Lance Armstrong, that he had got his success through cheating. He'd been taking performance-enhancing drugs. No doubt he was a wonderful athlete, but that alone was not enough. See, for him, success was his idol. Winning would come for him at all costs. He would bend the rules, he would look the other way, he would take performance-enhancing drugs so that he could win. Because for him, if he could win, if he could have that success and that adulation, then his life was complete. Then everything that he had would give him that satisfaction. But look at how that idol controlled him, and look at how it eventually brought him down to nothing. And if you're a pastor or a church leader listening here, you know your church can turn into an idol. Your church growth can turn into an idol. Success in ministry can turn into an idol. Even your influence as a church or your influence as a leader, that itself can become an idol, something that you work towards, that owns you, that you want above all things. But back to the story for a second. Don't forget that this was Israelites. This was God's own people. They had not forgotten the stories about God. Gideon made that clear. We saw that last week in chapter 6, verse 13. They knew about his stories. They knew about all of his wonderful deeds of former generations. And yet they took these idols in alongside Yahweh, alongside their own God. Externally and formally, perhaps they were worshipping Yahweh, the God of Israel, but internally, functionally, they were worshipping idols. And God said, you must destroy these idols before the blessing comes, because you cannot expect God's blessing when busy serving idols. American pastor Tim Keller says that this is how spiritual renewal often begins, by a ridding of idols, an identification and a ridding of our idols, clearing the way for the Spirit of God to do marvelous work. Let me read to you, though, this blog post I came across recently from another pastor called Ray Ortland. He writes this. He says, you and I are not integrated. We are not unified whole persons. Our hearts are multiply divided. There is something like a boardroom in every heart. Big table, leather chairs, coffee, bottled water, a whiteboard. A committee sits around that table. There is the social self, the private self, the work self, the sexual self, the recreational self, the religious self, the childhood memory self, and many others. The committee is arguing and debating and voting, constantly agitated, always upset. Rarely do they come to a unanimous decision. We are just like that. We tell ourselves it's because we are so busy, with so many responsibilities, but the truth is we're just indecisive. We're held back by small thoughts about Jesus. A person in this condition, you see, he says, can accept Jesus in either of two ways. One is to invite him onto your committee. Give Jesus a vote too. But then he's just one influence among many. This way of inviting Jesus is common here in the Bible Belt, or Northern Ireland, we could say. But it isn't Christianity as defined by the New Testament. The other way is to accept Jesus and say to him, my life isn't working. Please come in and fire my committee, every last one of them. I hand myself over to you now. Please run my whole life for me. Show me that it works. This is not complication. This is salvation. Accepting Jesus, he finishes by saying, is not just adding Jesus. It is subtracting all the idols. Friends, we cannot expect God's blessing when we are busy serving idols. We can't have both. We're just using God, if we try and do that, to get what we want rather than worshipping him. So I wonder, as you listen to this, what is God pointing out in your life right now? What has an overarching grip on you, influencing you, controlling you? What are you holding on to in your life? What is restricting you? What is preventing you from receiving the blessing of God? Because you cannot expect God's blessing when you're busy serving idols.